Everything we thought we understood about women's basketball changed the moment one name was missing. Not injured. Not unavailable. Just quietly left off the biggest roster in the sport. And from the outside, it looked like a normal basketball decision. Experience over hype. Veterans over rookies. Business as usual. But the reaction told a very different story. Because this wasn't just about who made Team USA. It was about who controls the game, who gets to decide when the next era begins, and how far the old guard was willing to go to protect its place. For months, fans were told to calm down. They were told the rookie wasn't ready. That the Olympic stage was different. That waiting your turn still mattered. But those explanations never fully landed, because the numbers didn't match the narrative. Ratings were exploding. Arenas were selling out. Merchandise was flying off shelves. And the player driving all of it wasn't just contributing to the league, she was the league's gravitational pull. Leaving her off the roster didn't feel strategic. It felt intentional. What made this moment different from every other controversial roster decision in sports history was the reaction from inside the house. Not unity. Not confidence. But defensiveness. Excuses. And eventually, quiet backtracking. The conversation shifted from basketball logic to something far more uncomfortable. Words like resentment, ego, fear. Suddenly, this wasn't about whether Caitlin Clark deserved a spot. It was about whether the system was ready to survive her success. And then the loudest voice in sports media stepped in and did what no one else was willing to do. He said the quiet part out loud. Not as speculation. Not as fan outrage. But as confirmation of what millions already believed. That this wasn't a coincidence. That this wasn't just about fit. And that behind closed doors, people were already realizing they may have made a massive mistake. Because once that door opened, it couldn't be closed again. What started as a roster snub became a referendum on the entire league. On how it treats its stars. On how it handles change. And on whether the people in power were protecting the game. Or protecting themselves. When Team USA finally released its official roster for Paris, the reaction wasn't confusion. It was disbelief. People didn't double-check the list because they thought they misread it. They checked it because the absence felt impossible. The most talked-about player in basketball wasn't just missing, she was erased. No asterisk. No explanation up front. Just gone. Immediately, the league leaned on its safest shield. Experience. The message was clean and rehearsed. The Olympics are different. Chemistry matters. Veterans have earned their place. Rookies will get their turn eventually. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In reality, it collapsed under even minimal scrutiny. Because this wasn't a borderline player we were talking about. This was the engine behind the league's sudden cultural relevance. The one filling arenas in cities that hadn't sold out in years. The one pulling casual fans into a sport they had never followed before. That's why the backlash wasn't polite. It wasn't analytical. It was visceral. Fans didn't feel disappointed, they felt insulted. As if they were being told to ignore what they were clearly seeing with their own eyes. The idea that this decision was purely basketball didn't survive a single news cycle. Because if basketball were the only factor, the choice would have been obvious. And everyone knew it. What made the reaction even louder was the timing. Women's basketball was finally riding a wave it had chased for decades. Networks were invested. Sponsors were leaning in. The sport had momentum that couldn't be manufactured or forced. And right at that moment, the governing powers chose to push away the biggest draw the game had ever seen. It felt less like caution and more like sabotage. Social media exploded, but this wasn't just online noise. Former players, analysts, and even neutral observers began asking the same question in different ways. How do you justify leaving out the player who brings the most attention to the sport? How do you grow the game while sidelining the person growing it for you? Those questions didn't have satisfying answers, and the longer the league waited to address them, the worse it looked. Instead of calming the storm, the silence fueled it. Every press appearance felt evasive. Every explanation sounded recycled. And slowly, a new interpretation began to take hold. That this wasn't about readiness or development. That it wasn't about protecting a young player from pressure. It was about protecting something else entirely. Because when fans looked at the decision, they didn't see logic. They saw fear. Fear that the hierarchy was shifting too fast. Fear that the spotlight was moving away from familiar faces. Fear that once the door fully opened for Caitlin Clark, it might never close again. And that fear, whether admitted or not, turned a simple roster announcement into the most explosive moment the league had seen in years. Long before the Olympic roster ever became public, the groundwork for this tension had already been laid. It didn't start with a list of names. It started with comments. Subtle at first. Framed as wisdom. Delivered with smiles and calm voices that made them sound harmless on the surface. Veterans speaking about how the league is different. How reality comes fast. How rookies always think they're ready until the grind hits them. At the time, many people brushed it off. That's just how the game works, they said. Older players have always tested the new ones. They pass down lessons the hard way. But as Caitlin Clark's popularity kept growing, those comments started to feel less like guidance and more like positioning. Almost as if the message wasn't "be prepared," but "know your place." The phrase that stuck wasn't even meant to be controversial. But once it was repeated, clipped, and replayed, it took on a life of its own. Reality is coming. To some, it sounded like a challenge. To others, it sounded like a warning. And to millions of new fans who were just discovering the sport through Clark, it felt dismissive. As if the joy and excitement she brought didn't count until it was approved by the people already at the top. What made the situation worse was how one-sided it felt. Caitlin Clark never responded. She didn't fire back. She didn't hint at disrespect. She just kept playing. And the louder the warnings became, the quieter she stayed. That contrast shifted public sympathy almost instantly. The rookie wasn't acting entitled. She wasn't claiming dominance. She was simply existing and winning, while others seemed increasingly uncomfortable with what that meant. Over time, social media began reframing the narrative. What was once framed as tough love started being called gatekeeping. Fans pointed out the pattern. Hard fouls that felt unnecessary. Defensive schemes that seemed personal. Post-game comments that downplayed historic performances. Individually, each moment could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture that was harder to ignore. This wasn't just about competition anymore. It felt like resistance. Like the league was struggling to decide whether it wanted to embrace its new audience or test them until they left. And that hesitation came at the worst possible time. Because while veterans were trying to slow the moment down, the moment was accelerating on its own. By the time the Olympic conversation surfaced, many fans already believed the outcome was predetermined. That the warnings were never about preparation. They were about control. About reminding everyone that fame doesn't automatically translate to power. And that belief turned what should have been routine commentary into evidence of something much deeper. The league may not have realized it at the time, but those early comments became the foundation for everything that followed. They created a lens through which every decision would be viewed. And once that lens was in place, there was no going back to the benefit of the doubt. For weeks, the debate stayed stuck in the same loop. Analysts danced around the issue. Former players softened their language. Everyone acknowledged the controversy without touching the core of it. And then Stephen A. Smith stepped in and shattered the rhythm. Not with speculation. Not with coded language. But with a blunt assessment that instantly reframed the entire conversation. He didn't focus on rotations or defensive schemes. He didn't hide behind Olympic precedent. He went straight to motive. Jealousy. Resentment. Fear of the spotlight shifting too fast. When someone with that level of influence says something like that on national television, it stops being a hot take and starts being a catalyst. Because suddenly, millions of fans felt validated. They weren't overreacting. They weren't imagining patterns. Someone inside the media power structure was confirming what they had been sensing all along. That moment changed the power dynamic overnight. The league could ignore angry fans. It could wait out social media storms. But it couldn't easily dismiss Stephen A. Smith. His words forced a choice. Either the veterans and decision-makers doubled down and accepted the villain role, or they quietly adjusted before the narrative became permanent. And the tension in that decision was obvious. What made his comments hit even harder was how they aligned with the timeline. The warnings, the snub, the silence. The contrast between Clark's on-court production and her off-court treatment. When laid out together, the basketball explanation looked thinner by the day. Smith didn't invent a new theory. He connected dots the league hoped would stay separate. Almost immediately, the tone across coverage began to shift. Some voices softened their criticism of Clark. Others reframed earlier comments. Words like impact, growth, and business started replacing skepticism. It wasn't loud. It wasn't announced. But it was noticeable. And that subtle change signaled something important was happening behind the scenes. Because once the jealousy angle entered the mainstream, it couldn't be unseen. Every interaction was now interpreted through that lens. Every quote carried subtext. Every omission felt intentional. The pressure wasn't just public anymore. It was reputational. Hall of Fame careers were being reevaluated in real time, not for what those players had done on the court, but for how they were handling the moment when the torch was clearly being passed. Stephen A. Smith didn't just criticize a decision. He exposed a vulnerability. The fear that the league's old hierarchy wasn't ready to share space with someone who had already outgrown it. And once that fear was spoken out loud, the league had no choice but to react. As the public argument raged, a quieter explanation began circulating behind the scenes. One that had nothing to do with jump shots or defensive assignments. The rumor was simple, but explosive. The issue wasn't whether Caitlin Clark was good enough to make Team USA. The issue was what would happen if she did make it, and didn't start. The scenario practically wrote itself. A close Olympic game. The offense stalls. Cameras pan to the bench. Caitlin Clark sitting there. The crowd reacts. Chants start. Social media erupts in real time. Suddenly, every possession becomes a referendum. Why isn't she in? Why isn't she shooting? Why are they ignoring the player everyone came to see? For a veteran-heavy roster built on hierarchy and seniority, that kind of pressure isn't just uncomfortable, it's destabilizing. According to the speculation, decision-makers feared the distraction more than they valued the talent. They didn't want a global audience questioning rotations. They didn't want bench optics overshadowing gold medal expectations. And they definitely didn't want a rookie's popularity to challenge established roles in the most visible tournament on Earth. So instead of managing the situation, they removed it entirely. From a control standpoint, it made sense. From a growth standpoint, it was catastrophic. Because in trying to avoid one narrative, they created a far bigger one. Instead of debates about minutes, the conversation became about exclusion. Instead of protecting chemistry, they fractured trust with the fan base that had just arrived. The irony was impossible to miss. Team USA has always represented unity. The best players putting differences aside for the flag. But this decision suggested something else. That egos still mattered. That comfort still outweighed opportunity. That the league's biggest stage couldn't handle its biggest star unless she was guaranteed to shine on someone else's terms. Fans didn't need insider confirmation to believe this version of events. It matched what they were already seeing. The tight whistles. The extra physical defense. The uneasy interviews. It all pointed to a league struggling with attention it couldn't fully control. And the Olympic roster became the final line of defense. But what truly exposed the flaw in that logic was what happened next. Because while the league braced for chaos, Caitlin Clark did something no one expected. She stepped away. Quietly. Completely. And by doing that, she turned the entire calculation upside down. In a sports world built on reactions, Caitlin Clark's response was almost unsettling. No interviews about disrespect. No cryptic posts. No public frustration. No attempt to rally fans on her behalf. Instead, she did the one thing that made the snub impossible to defend. She went quiet. Not passive-aggressive quiet. Not sulking quiet. Professional quiet. While the media expected an emotional response, she offered none. Reports surfaced that she congratulated the team privately and immediately returned her focus to Indiana. That single move rewrote the entire narrative. Because suddenly, the story no longer centered on a young star demanding recognition. It centered on an institution that looked increasingly uncomfortable explaining why it had pushed her aside. Her silence exposed the imbalance. If she had complained, the league could frame her as entitled. If she had argued, they could accuse her of immaturity. But by opting out of the conversation entirely, she forced everyone else to keep talking. And the more they talked, the worse it sounded. Every justification now felt defensive. Every explanation felt reactive. This is where the power truly shifted. Caitlin Clark didn't need Team USA anymore. By stepping away, she turned herself into the constant what if hovering over every Olympic broadcast. Every slow offensive stretch. Every tight finish. The question lingered without being asked. And that question was louder than any criticism she could have voiced. Fans noticed the contrast immediately. One side looked calm, focused, and above the drama. The other looked rattled, stuck explaining a decision that refused to age well. Instead of diminishing her presence, the snub amplified it. She became the absence everyone felt. The name commentators avoided, but audiences kept thinking about. There was also something else happening beneath the surface. By removing herself from the situation, Clark protected her long-term leverage. She didn't tie her image to a tense locker room. She didn't force herself into an environment where resentment might linger. She stayed where she was supported, celebrated, and central. And in doing so, she reminded everyone that visibility doesn't always come from participation. Sometimes it comes from restraint. This wasn't accidental. Whether intentional or instinctive, it was a masterclass in narrative control. She let the league wrestle with its decision alone. She let the veterans carry the weight of public perception. And as the weeks passed, the silence began to feel less like humility and more like quiet confidence. Because the longer she said nothing, the clearer it became. She wasn't waiting for approval. She had already moved on. And that realization forced the league to confront something it wasn't prepared for. The idea that its most valuable star didn't need its biggest stage to validate her place in the sport. Not all apologies come with words. Some come disguised as praise. And once the backlash reached a level the league could no longer contain, the shift began. It wasn't announced. There was no press release. No formal admission that anything had gone wrong. But if you listened closely, the language changed almost overnight. Voices that once warned about growing pains started talking about impact. The same players who had stressed patience began emphasizing how much Caitlin Clark was doing for the game. Podcasts softened. Interviews became warmer. Compliments replaced caution. And to anyone paying attention, it was obvious this wasn't coincidence. It was correction. Sue Bird's tone in particular stood out. Once framed as a gatekeeper in the eyes of fans, she began acknowledging Clark's unprecedented influence on the business of basketball. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. This wasn't about waiting your turn anymore. This was about recognizing a moment that couldn't be stopped. In the world of high-level sports politics, that kind of pivot is an apology. Because direct apologies rarely happen when egos are involved. Instead, the regret shows up in behavior. In reframing. In sudden generosity where skepticism once lived. And that's exactly what fans were witnessing. The narrative wasn't being reversed, it was being carefully rewritten. The reason was simple. The pressure was no longer just coming from fans. Sponsors were watching. Networks were watching. Executives were watching. The Olympics were supposed to be a celebration of the sport's growth, but instead they became a reminder of what was missing. Ratings were solid, but everyone knew what they could have been. And that gap was impossible to ignore. This is where the league's internal conflict became visible. On one hand, there was pride. On the other, there was reality. Caitlin Clark wasn't a future asset anymore. She was a present one. And every moment spent resisting that truth was costing real money. Real attention. Real momentum. So the tone shifted. Quietly. Strategically. without ever admitting fault. But fans understood exactly what it meant. The warnings had failed. The exclusion had backfired. And now, the same voices that once tried to slow her rise were scrambling to make sure they weren't remembered as the ones who stood in its way. Because history doesn't remember intentions. It remembers outcomes. And the outcome of the snub was clear. Caitlin Clark didn't fade. The resistance to her did. Once the emotional arguments fell apart, the conversation drifted toward the one thing that never lies. Money. Because beneath every debate about culture and respect was a far more uncomfortable truth. Caitlin Clark wasn't just changing the game on the court. She was changing the economics of the league in a way no one had ever seen before. Ticket prices surged the moment she came to town. Arenas that struggled to fill seats were suddenly selling out. Television ratings didn't just improve, they spiked. Entire broadcasts were built around her presence. Sponsors followed the attention. Merch followed the sponsors. And for the first time in decades, women's basketball had a single, undeniable engine driving mass interest. That kind of influence doesn't just elevate a player. It redistributes power. For veterans who had spent years fighting for visibility, this created a strange paradox. They had demanded growth. They had pushed for better pay, better coverage, and better treatment. And now that growth was finally here, it wasn't coming through the system they built. It was coming through one player who bypassed the slow grind entirely. That reality made people uncomfortable. The fear wasn't that Caitlin Clark would fail. It was that she wouldn't. That she would succeed so loudly and so quickly that it would expose how fragile the old hierarchy really was. When one rookie can move revenue the way an entire generation couldn't, it forces hard questions. Who gets credit? Who gets control? And who gets left behind? This is why the snub felt so short-sighted. By excluding Clark, the league didn't protect its veterans. It undermined them. Fans started asking why players who had long spoken about financial inequality would stand in the way of the very person expanding the pie. The optics were brutal. Complaints about pay rang hollow when the league's biggest draw was being sidelined for the sake of comfort. And the irony didn't go unnoticed. The same veterans who benefited from decades of stability were now resisting the chaos that growth requires. They wanted evolution without disruption. Progress without displacement. But sports history doesn't work that way. Every era ends the same way. Not with permission, but with replacement. Caitlin Clark represented that shift whether anyone liked it or not. She didn't need to campaign for influence. It followed her naturally. And that scared people who were used to earning attention through time served rather than value created. Because when the market speaks this loudly, it doesn't ask for consensus. It makes decisions on its own. The league was forced to confront a truth it had avoided for years. Popularity is power. And once that power shifts, no committee vote can put it back where it was. By the time the Olympics wrapped up, the outcome on the court was almost beside the point. Team USA did what it was expected to do. Gold medals were won. Celebrations followed. But the larger story didn't end with a podium. It lingered in everything that came after. In the conversations. In the coverage. In the way the league began positioning its future. Because even without wearing the jersey, Caitlin Clark had already changed the trajectory. She didn't force her way into the system. She waited it out. And in doing so, she exposed how temporary the resistance really was. Veterans age. Careers wind down. Committees change. But momentum, once it's captured, doesn't reverse. The idea that she needed Team USA to validate her stardom collapsed completely. If anything, the absence proved the opposite. She had outgrown the structure that tried to contain her. And when the next international cycle arrives, the dynamic will be unrecognizable. She won't be the rookie being evaluated. She'll be the centerpiece everyone is built around. Stephen A. Smith's continued commentary kept that pressure alive. By refusing to let the story fade, he made sure the league couldn't quietly reset the narrative. Each reminder served the same purpose. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a moment of fear. Fear of replacement. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of losing control over a league that was finally breaking into the mainstream. What followed was a careful retreat. Praise replaced resistance. Inclusion replaced exclusion. And the idea of passing the torch became the new language of survival. Not because everyone suddenly agreed, but because fighting the inevitable had become too costly. Gatekeepers don't disappear overnight. They fade when their influence stops working. And that's exactly what happened here. Caitlin Clark didn't challenge them directly. She let time, numbers, and attention do the work for her. And in the end, that was far more effective than any public argument could have been. The league didn't crown her. The fans did. And once that happens, no amount of institutional hesitation can undo it. This wasn't just the rise of a new star. It was the end of an era built on permission rather than performance. In the end, the phrase everyone kept repeating turned out to be true, just not in the way it was intended. Reality did come. But it didn't arrive for Caitlin Clark. It arrived for the league that underestimated what it had in front of it. The Team USA snub wasn't just a miscalculation. It was a stress test. A moment that exposed how unprepared the system was for a player who didn't follow the traditional timeline. Caitlin Clark didn't climb the ladder rung by rung. She skipped steps. She brought an audience with her. And that forced uncomfortable conversations about control, ego, and relevance. The old hierarchy tried to hold its shape. It relied on experience, tradition, and seniority to slow the moment down. But the fans didn't care about any of that. They cared about excitement. They cared about access. They cared about watching someone change the game in real time. And once that preference became obvious, the power dynamic shifted permanently. What makes this story linger isn't bitterness. It's clarity. The apologies didn't come as statements. They came as behavior changes. Softer language. Sudden praise. Quiet inclusion. And that's how you know the lesson landed. Not because anyone admitted fault, but because no one is trying to repeat the mistake. Caitlin Clark never needed validation from Team USA, the veterans, or the gatekeepers. She proved that by walking away from the noise and letting the numbers speak. Attention followed her anyway. Momentum followed her anyway. And the league had no choice but to adjust. This wasn't about one roster. It was about the future of women's basketball deciding itself, faster than anyone in power expected. The gatekeepers didn't lose because they were wrong. They lost because the audience moved on without them. And that's the part that can't be undone. If you found this breakdown useful and want more deep dives like this, the politics, the power shifts, the stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing helps the algorithm understand that this kind of long-form, analytical content matters. Also, like the video if you want more coverage on women's basketball, media narratives, and how sports really work behind the scenes. And most importantly, leave a comment. Do you think the league learned its lesson, or will this tension resurface the next time a star breaks the system? Your engagement directly helps small channels grow, and it tells YouTube to push this content to more people who care about the game.